He had lived 40 years without ever holding a woman's hand, not because no one offered, but because every time one came close, he stepped back into the silence he knew better than warmth. The night the storm hit Blue Creek Valley, Elias Holt stood in his barn doorway with a lantern and a pride so stubborn it nearly made him turn a stranger away into the dark. Nearly. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very last word, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Elias Holt had not spoken more than a dozen words to any living person in 11 days. He knew this because he counted. Not out of loneliness, at least, that's what he told himself. He counted because words cost something, and he'd learned long ago that the things you spend too freely are the first things taken from you. The summer of 1887 had come to Blue Creek Valley like it always did, hard and golden and merciless. The grass on his upper pastures had gone the color of wheat straw by the end of June. His cattle were manageable, his fences held, his horses were fat and healthy, and asked nothing of him except hay water and the occasional firm hand. Elias understood animals. He did not understand people. He had stopped trying long before most men his age had finished figuring out which direction their lives were pointed. 40 years old, unmarried, untouched, unasked. That last part wasn't entirely true, but it was easier to believe than the alternative that he had been asked once or twice in the way a woman asks a man without using words at all, and he had looked away every single time. Not out of coldness, out of something that sat much deeper than cold. I was afraid. He just didn't have a name for it yet. That morning he'd ridden his fence line before the sun was fully up, checking for breaks in the wire where the elk had pushed through the night before. He found 3 spots, patched 2, marked the third with a strip of red cloth to come back to after he'd eaten. He rode back to the barn, unsaddled his mare, brushed her out, and led her into the paddock without a word. Inside the house, he made coffee, the way he always made it, black, strong, and barely enough to fill the bottom of the cup. He ate standing at the counter. Cornbread left over from 2 days ago. Sliced, smoked venison. A handful of dried apricots that he chewed slowly and without pleasure. The house was clean. It was always clean. Order was a discipline he'd inherited from his father and kept alive like a religion. But the house was also empty in a way that no amount of cleaning could fix. He'd stopped noticing it, or so he believed. He carried his coffee out to the porch and looked at the sky. What he saw made him set the cup down on the railing. The western horizon had gone the color of a bruise. Not the slow rolling gray of a summer rain system, something faster, something angrier. The clouds were stacking on each other in tall formations that flickered at the base, and the wind that had been coming from the south all morning had just switched direction without warning. Elias had lived in Blue Creek Valley since he was 19. He knew its weather the way he knew the rhythm of his own breathing. This was not an ordinary storm. "Well," he said to nobody, "that's coming fast." I went back inside, pulled on his work coat, and spent the next 2 hours doing what needed to be done before a hard storm hit. He brought the horses in from the paddock. He moved the hay bales further from the barn doors. He checked the latches on the chicken coop, the tool shed, the smokehouse. He filled the rain barrels and weighted down the canvas covers on the woodpile. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky was the color of iron, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. By 5, the first lightning hit somewhere up on the ridge. By 6, the rain was coming sideways. Elias was inside the barn, working by lantern light, repairing a broken bridle that had been waiting on his workbench for 2 weeks when he heard it. Not thunder. A knock. He stopped moving. 3 knocks. Deliberate. Each one harder than the last. He set down the bridle and looked at the barn door. His first thought was that a board had come loose in the wind and was banging against the frame. His second thought was that no loose board knocked 3 times with that much intent. His third thought was, nobody comes out to Blue Creek in a storm like this unless something has gone very wrong. He picked up the lantern and walked to the barn door. He pulled it open 6 inches and looked out into the dark and the driving rain. A woman stood 3 feet away from him, soaked to the bone, holding the reins of a horse that looked about ready to collapse. She was not young in the way that made men foolish. She was somewhere past 30, with dark hair plastered flat against her face, and eyes that were doing something complicated, calculating him. He realized the same way he was calculating her, deciding whether to trust. "I am sorry to bother you," she said. Her voice was steady despite everything. "My wagon axle broke about a mile back on the road. I have a child with me. She's only 8. I don't—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "I don't know this road well. I don't know how far the next town is. I just need somewhere dry until the storm passes." He looked past her into the rain. Behind the horse, barely visible in the dark, was a small covered wagon leaning at a terrible angle. And standing beside it, pressed against the wheel with both arms wrapped around herself, was a girl. Small, soaked, shaking. Something moved in Elias's chest that he didn't have a word for either. He pulled the barn door all the way open. "Bring the horse in," he said. "Then go get the girl." The woman blinked, like she'd expected him to say no, like she'd been prepared for him to say no and had her argument ready and now had nothing to do with it. "Thank you," she said. The 2 words carried more weight than he expected. Her name was Margaret Alden. Cole. "Maggie," she told him while he was helping her get the exhausted horse settled into an empty stall. She said it matter-of-factly, the way people give their name when they've learned it costs less to be straightforward than to be mysterious. She was from Billings originally. She was headed to a town called Harlan's Creek, which Elias had been to once, and remembered as a hard little place with more ambition than sense. She didn't tell him why she was going there. He didn't ask. The girl's name was Nora. She sat on a hay bale with a horse blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she watched Elias with very large, very serious eyes that didn't miss a single thing. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just watched. "She's quiet," Elias said. "She's always quiet," Maggie said without looking up from wringing water out of the hem of her skirt. "She's been watching people long enough to know that most of what they say isn't worth listening to." Elias looked at the girl. The girl looked back at him. "Smart," he said. Something shifted in the girl's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Maggie had pulled a small satchel out of the wagon before they'd come in dry clothes for Nora, a little food, the things a woman grabs when she knows she might not make it back to her wagon for a while. She'd done that automatically, Elias noticed. She'd thought ahead even in the rain, even in the dark, even when her hands were shaking. He respected that without saying so. He built a small fire in the iron stove at the back of the barn, the one he used in winter when animals needed extra warmth, and he hung the girl's wet dress and Maggie's coat on the line above it to dry. He found a clean bucket and filled it with water from the cistern. He offered what food he had on hand in the barn: dried meat, 2 apples, half a block of hard cheese that he kept in the cool box near the back wall. Nora ate the way hungry children eat, seriously and without apology. Maggie ate like a woman who had been telling herself she wasn't hungry for hours. Elias sat on the workbench and didn't eat anything because he'd already had supper, and because something about watching them eat made him feel that the food belonged to them now more than to him. "You live here alone?" Maggie asked. She wasn't being intrusive. She was a woman in a strange man's barn in a storm, and she was establishing the shape of her situation. "Yes," he said. "Long time, 11 years. She nodded slowly, looked around the barn, at the clean stalls, at the tools hung in order on their hooks, at the lanterns, each one trimmed and full of oil. "You keep a good place," she said. "I try." Outside, the storm hit its worst. The rain became something that sounded less like weather and more like a physical force, a sustained roar against the roof, against the walls, against the world in general. Lightning cracked close enough to make Nora flinch and grip the horse blanket tighter. "It's all right," Maggie said, moving to sit beside her daughter without hesitation. "That one was far. See no shake in the ground." "You reckon it'll last long?" Nora asked. The first words Elias had heard her say. "No more than a few hours," Elias said. "Storms like this burn hot and move fast. It'll be past before midnight." The girl looked at him with that measuring look again. "You know about storms?" she asked. "I've watched a good many of them." "From in here or from outside?" Depends on the storm. Nora seemed to consider this with the gravity of a philosophy professor. I think, she said carefully, that if I had to be somewhere during a storm, a barn would be a pretty good choice, because of the animals. They're calm. She was right. The horses had settled. They stood in their stalls with their heads low, breathing steady. Even the exhausted horse Maggie had brought in had stopped trembling. They know the barn won't fall, Elias said. That's why they're calm. Do you know that? Nora asked. That the barn won't fall. He looked at the girl for a moment. Yes, he said. I built it. Nora nodded satisfied and went back to her cheese. Maggie was watching him. He could feel it without looking. Not the way a woman watches a man she's interested in. He wouldn't have known what to do with that. It was something more careful than that. The way someone watches a person they're trying to understand, because understanding matters to them. He looked at her then, and she didn't look away. Where's her father? He asked. He hadn't meant to ask it. It came out of him the same way honesty sometimes does arriving before permission. Maggie's face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Gone, she said. Not bitter. Not sad. Just definitive in the way that word is when a person has already finished grieving. He nodded. Said nothing else. They sat in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Elias didn't understand why it wasn't uncomfortable in his experience. Silence with strangers was always a negotiation, a waiting for someone to say something meaningless so the other person could agree with it. This was different. This silence had room in it. Around 9 o'clock. Nora fell asleep on the hay bale curled under the horse blanket with her hair still damp and her face completely peaceful. Maggie arranged the blanket more fully around her shoulders and then came back and sat on the stool near the stove. She sleeps like that anywhere, Maggie said quietly. She always has. I used to think it was a gift. Then I realized it's because she learned early that she had to sleep whenever the chance came, because sometimes the chance doesn't come again for a while. Elias was quiet for a moment. You've had some hard years, he said. Not a question. We've had some hard years, she corrected gently. But we're all right. We know how to manage. Where's your family? He stopped. I'm sorry. I don't normally ask questions. It's fine, Maggie said. I don't normally answer them. I've got a sister in Harlan's Creek. She's been after me to come for 2 years. I finally decided she was right. She paused. It took me longer than it should have. Some decisions do, Elias said. What about you? She wasn't pressing. She was just making the conversation fair. He thought about not answering. He thought about saying nothing or saying something general and unmemorable. But the storm was still going, and the barn was warm, and somehow this woman sitting 3 feet away from him, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes honest and steady, made pretending feel more exhausting than truth. I came here at 19, he said. My father's land. He died when I was 17 and I worked 2 years saving enough to come out and work it properly. I thought, he paused, I thought I'd build something and then there'd be people in it. Maggie was listening. Actually listening, not the polite waiting for you to finish kind of listening. The kind that has weight. And, she said. And I built something, he said. And then there were horses in it, and cattle in it, and grain in it, and everything except what I thought there'd be. People, she said. People. The fire crackled. Outside the rain began to thin, not gone yet, but losing its anger. The lightning had moved east, its flicker visible now only in the distances between the boards. You never... She stopped herself. Never what? He said. She shook her head slightly. I was going to ask something too personal. You already know I came out here at 19 and built a ranch by myself, and I've been alone for 11 years, Elias said. I reckon you can ask the question you were going to ask. Something like a smile crossed her face, brief but real. You never let anyone in, she said. Not in all that time. He was quiet for a long time. There was a woman, he said finally. Once, a long time ago, before I came here. He looked at his hands. She left for someone else. And I decided I suppose that I just wasn't built for that. For letting people close. He paused. I told myself that wasn't a loss, that it was a preference. But it wasn't a preference, Maggie said. No, he said. It was a wall I built because I didn't know how to do anything else. The admission surprised him. He'd never said it out loud before. He wasn't sure he'd ever let himself think it clearly enough to say it. Maggie didn't fill the silence after that with reassurances or easy sympathy. She just let the words sit where they'd landed, which was more respectful than anything she could have said. After a while, she spoke. I think walls are understandable, she said. I think the people who've never built one are the people who've never had a real reason to. And I think... She stopped choosing her words carefully. I think sometimes it takes something you didn't plan for to show you where the door in the wall is. He looked at her. She looked back. Or someone, she added, quietly, without drama, as though she were simply noting a fact. Outside, the rain had gone from a roar to a murmur. Elias stood up from the workbench and walked to the barn door and opened it a few inches. The storm had broken. The sky still rolled with cloud, but the lightning was long gone east, and the air had that scrubbed, cold, clean smell that comes after a hard summer rain. He stood there for a moment. Then he said without turning around, You can sleep in here tonight, both of you. It's dry and it's warm and the road'll be muddy until morning anyway. There's no sense starting out in the dark. Behind him, Maggie said, You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm choosing to. A pause. Thank you, she said. The same two words as before, but heavier now. He didn't turn around. He looked out at the dark, washed, clean valley, at the pale gleam of water, standing in the low places at the stars, just beginning to show themselves at the edges of the cloud. He'd lived 40 years without ever letting anyone pass the barn door, and tonight for the first time, he was glad he'd opened it. Nora woke up before the sun did. Elias heard her first, a small rustling sound from the hay bale, then the soft pad of bare feet on the barn floor. He'd been awake already, sitting on the workbench with cold coffee he'd made on the small stove an hour before, watching the dark outside the barn door go from black to deep blue to the gray-purple that meant dawn was 20 minutes away. The girl appeared at the edge of his lantern-light hair, sticking up on one side, horse blanket still dragging behind her. She looked at him without surprise, as though she'd known he'd be awake. You sleep out here? She asked. I don't sleep much, he said. She considered that. My mama says people who don't sleep much are either thinking too hard or afraid of their dreams. Elias looked at his coffee cup. She sounds like a smart woman. She is, Nora said with the absolute certainty that only an 8-year-old can produce. She's the smartest person I know, but she doesn't always know what's good for herself. She said it without cruelty, the way children state observations they've simply absorbed from watching the adults around them. She knows what's good for everybody else, though. That's what her sister says. You've met her sister? Twice. She writes letters. Nora sat herself down on the stool near the stove, pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, and looked at him steadily. Are you going to let us fix the wagon here, or do we have to find somewhere else? The question hit him with its directness before he had time to organize a response. Where'd that come from? He asked. I woke up thinking about it, Nora said. The axle's broke. We can't go anywhere until it's fixed. Mama won't ask you herself because she doesn't like asking people for things. So I'm asking. Elias set down the coffee cup. You always do the asking for her. When she needs me to, Nora said simply. He looked at this girl, this serious, watchful too, old for her age girl with hay in her hair and a horse blanket around her shoulders, and something in the region of his chest did that unnamed thing again. The thing it had done last night when he'd seen her standing in the rain pressed against the wagon wheel. I'll look at the axle after breakfast, he said. We'll see what needs doing. Nora nodded satisfied and went back to sleep on the hay bale as though the matter was entirely settled. Maggie was awake when Elias came back inside the house to make proper coffee and breakfast. He found her already in his kitchen, standing at his stove with a fire going that she'd built herself and a skillet heating that she'd found in his cabinet without asking. He stopped in the doorway. She glanced at him over her shoulder. I hope that's all right, she said. I needed to do something useful. I can't sit still after a bad night. It's all right, he said. I found eggs. I found salt pork. I hope you don't mind." "I don't mind." She turned back to the stove. He sat down at the kitchen table without quite knowing why. He never sat at the kitchen table for breakfast. He ate standing at the counter and had for years. But somehow sitting felt right, the way a few things had felt right last night that he hadn't expected to feel right at all. "Nora woke up before dawn," he said. Maggie laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it was not at all what he'd expected. Not a polite sound, not a social sound, but a real one, low and genuine and warm. "Of course she did. She always does when she's got something on her mind. Did she ask you about the wagon?" He paused. "She did." Maggie turned to face him fully, and now there was color in her face. "I am so sorry. She doesn't have a she just says things. I've tried to teach her to be more—" "Don't," Elias said. She stopped. "Don't apologize for her," he said. "She asked a fair question. I gave her a fair answer. I'll look at the axle after we eat." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stove, and he thought he caught in the moment before she turned something passing across her face that wasn't quite composure. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table, the three of them, because Nora had migrated from the barn to the house at some point and installed herself in the third chair as though she'd always sat there. She ate eggs with focused determination and did not speak, which Elias was beginning to understand was not absence of thought, but simply a preference for thinking before talking. It was the most company Elias had sat down to in 11 years. He kept waiting for it to feel wrong. For the crowding feeling he'd expected every time he'd imagined people in this house. For the sense of invasion. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and more unsettling. Something that felt disturbingly like he'd been doing this wrong the whole time. The axle was bad. He knew it before he even got under the wagon from the angle of the lean and the way the left rear wheel had splayed outward. When he got underneath and looked, he found not just a cracked axle shaft, but a sheared bolt and a bent bracket that had been. He could tell by the way the metal had stressed under too much strain for too long before it finally let go. He came out from under the wagon and stood up. Maggie was standing a few feet away, watching him with her arms folded and her jaw set in the particular way of someone bracing for news they already suspect is bad. "How long?" she asked. "To fix it right, 3 days, maybe 4. He paused. "The shaft needs a new piece. I've got the iron stock, but I'll have to mill it on the forge. The bracket I can straighten, but it needs to be reheated and worked, and then it has to cool slow, or it'll crack again under load." Maggie was quiet. He watched her process it. Not panic. He'd been right about her. She didn't panic, but something that moved through her eyes like weather before she pushed it down and replaced it with practicality. "Is there a smithy in town I could hire?" she asked. "Nearest town is Callaway, 12 miles. The smithy there does good work, but he's got a 3-week backlog. It's summer. Everybody needs him." "So 3 days here," she said, "or 3 weeks in Callaway." "That's the shape of it." She pressed her lips together, looked at the wagon, looked back at him. "I don't want to impose on you for 3 days, Mr. Holt." "You're not imposing," he said. "I am, though," she said. "I'm a stranger. I showed up in the middle of the night with a child and a broken wagon, and I've already eaten your food and used your barn." "Maggie." He stopped. He'd used her name without thinking. The sound of it surprised both of them. She went still. "The guest room's been empty for 11 years, he said. "The barn's got more space than I use. I've got the materials, and I've got the time. If it makes you feel better, you can help out while you're here. There's always work on a ranch." He paused. "But don't stand there and apologize for needing something. That's a waste of both our time." The color came back to her face in a rush, and this time she didn't turn away fast enough to hide what was on it. "All right," she said, quietly. "All right, thank you." He picked up his tools and went back to work. He didn't see her expression in the moment after he turned away. But Nora did. The girl had been sitting on the fence rail 10 feet away the entire time, watching all of it with those enormous missing-nothing eyes. And what she saw on her mother's face was something she hadn't seen in a very long time. She didn't have a word for it yet, but she recognized it the way children recognize warmth, by the way it changed the air. The first day passed in the practical language of work. Elias spent most of it at the forge heating and working the iron for the new axle shaft. Maggie, true to her word, asked him what needed doing on the ranch and did it. She wasn't a woman who needed to be shown things twice. He showed her how he liked the feed measured for the horses, and she did it that way. He told her the east pasture gate had a broken latch and pointed to the tool shed, and an hour later the gate was fixed and the tools were back where they'd come from. Nora made herself useful in the way 8-year-olds do, imperfectly and with tremendous commitment. She gathered eggs. She refilled the water troughs. She sat beside Elias at the forge for an hour and watched him work the iron, asking questions that were so specific and genuinely curious that he found himself answering them more fully than he intended. "Why do you hit it when it's hot?" she asked. "Because hot metal moves," he said. "Cold metal breaks." "Is that true for other things?" He looked at her sideways. "What kind of other things?" She shrugged small shoulders, rising and falling. "I don't know. People, maybe." He was quiet for a moment, turning the iron in the coals. "Maybe," he said. "Yeah, maybe that's true for people too." She seemed pleased by the answer and went off to find something else to do. By evening of the first day, the three of them had fallen into a rhythm that had no reason to exist and existed anyway. Nora setting the table without being asked. Maggie cooking without apology. Elias carrying in wood and filling the lamps and taking the chair at the head of the table that he'd sat in alone for 11 years. It was ordinary. It was so ordinary, it hurt. I didn't say that. He ate his supper and answered Nora's questions about elk and listened to Maggie describe her sister's letters, and he felt the ordinary hurt settle into him like a bruise he'd been carrying without knowing it had been there. After supper, Nora fell asleep on the sitting room floor with one of his old surveying maps spread out in front of her finger, still pointing at a mountain range she'd been asking him about when sleep took her mid-sentence. He and Maggie sat on the porch. The evening was warm and clear. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, and the stars over Blue Creek were the kind that made you aware of how small you were, and strangely, how that wasn't entirely a bad feeling. "She's going to be someone extraordinary," Elias said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but there it was. Maggie looked down at her hands. "I know," she said. "I try to make sure she has room to be. That's the whole thing, really making enough room, not filling it up with fear." "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm afraid of everything," Maggie said, and she said it so plainly, so without defensiveness, that it stopped him completely. "I'm afraid I'm doing it wrong. I'm afraid I'm not giving her enough. I'm afraid I'm going to get to Harlan's Creek, and it won't be what I imagined, and I'll have made her leave one hard place for another one." She paused. "But you can't let the fear make the decisions. That's the part I figured out. The fear can talk all it wants. It just doesn't get to drive." He looked at her. She was looking at the stars. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "The hard way," she said. "The only way most things worth knowing get learned." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother used to say something like that. She'd say, 'Fear is just love with nowhere to go.'" Maggie turned to look at him. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother to anyone in years. He wasn't sure why he'd said it. The words had come from somewhere that didn't usually have an exit. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Maggie said. "She was," he said. "She died when I was 15, before she could finish explaining most things." He paused. "I spent a long time trying to figure them out on my own." And, Maggie said. He let out a breath. "Still working on it." She smiled. And this time it wasn't brief. It stayed, and in the starlight it was something he hadn't seen directed at him in so long that he didn't know what to do with it. So he looked back at the sky and let it exist without doing anything about it. The second day brought a different kind of trouble. He'd ridden out to the upper pasture early to check on the cattle after the storm, and when he came back he found 2 horses tied to his fence post that he didn't own. 2 men he'd never seen before stood in his yard, and Maggie stood on his porch steps with Nora behind her, one hand pressed flat to her side in the particular stillness of someone keeping themselves very controlled. He rode in at a pace that was faster than necessary and pulled his mare up between the men and the porch. "Help you," he said. "Not a question," Not really. The closer of the two men was wide through the shoulders, with a face that had done too much squinting in too much sun, and eyes that held the particular quality of a man used to being the most dangerous thing in a room. He had a deputy's badge on his vest. "Looking for a woman named Margaret Cole," the man said. "And a girl. We were told they came through this way last night." Every muscle in Elias went quiet. The specific kind of quiet that comes before a decision. "Who told you that?" he said. "Man at the crossroads. Said he saw a woman and a girl on the Blue Creek Road before the storm hit." Elias didn't look at Maggie. He kept his eyes on the deputy. "I've got a ranch hand who came through with his daughter last night," he said. "They're sheltering while I do some repair work. Why are you looking for this woman?" The deputy's eyes moved to the porch, to Maggie, back to Elias. "Her husband sent us," he said. The word hit Elias like cold water. He kept his face neutral through it. "Her husband," he repeated. "Mr. Gerald Cole, businessman out of Billings. His wife and daughter left without his permission 6 days ago. He wants them brought back." Elias finally looked at Maggie then, just for a moment. What he saw on her face was not guilt. It was not shame. It was not the face of a woman who'd done something wrong. It was the face of someone who'd been running from something that called itself by a legal name. He looked back at the deputy. "I don't know anyone named Margaret Cole," he said. "The woman on my porch is Mrs. Margaret Allen. She's been working this ranch for 3 months. You've got the wrong people." The deputy stared at him. Nora, behind her mother, did not make a single sound. "That's so," the deputy said slowly. "That's so," Elias said. "Now I've got work to finish and a forge burning, so if you've got nothing further to say to me, I'd appreciate you taking your horses off my fence." The deputy looked at him for a long time, looked at Maggie, looked back at Elias. Then he untied his horse. "We'll be checking the area," he said, "in case anyone matching that description turns up." "You do that," Elias said. He sat on his mare without moving until both men had ridden back down the trail and were gone from sight. Then he dismounted, tied his horse, and walked to the porch. Maggie was holding herself together with visible effort, both hands pressed now to her sternum like she was keeping something in. Nora had come out from behind her and was standing at her side, pressed to her hip, one arm wrapped around her mother's waist. Elias stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Husband," he said. Quiet, flat. Maggie met his eyes. "Yes." "You want to tell me about him?" It wasn't a question. She knew it wasn't. She sat down on the porch step, and Nora sat beside her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maggie said, "Gerald Cole is a businessman and a well-respected man in Billings who sits on 3 civic committees and donates to the church building fund every year. Everyone in Billings thinks very highly of Gerald Cole." She paused. "High is also," she said, "a man who believes that a wife and child are things a man owns, the same way he owns his accounts and his property and his inventory. Things that exist for his use and go where he says they go." Elias was quiet. "Did he hurt you?" he asked. The question came out of him with an edge on it that he hadn't controlled. Maggie looked at him. "Not in ways that leave marks," she said. "He was very careful about that." She looked down at her hands. "But a person can be worn away without being struck. You can be taken apart without anyone laying a finger on you. And one morning I looked at Nora, she was 7, and I watched her watching him, watching how small she made herself when he was in the room, and I thought, this is what she's learning. This is what I'm teaching her. By staying." She stopped, drew a breath. So we left. The porch was silent. Nora, pressed against her mother's side, said nothing. She'd heard this before. Maybe not all of it, not in these words, but the shape of it, the weight of it. Children absorb the things adults think they're hiding, and they carry them without being asked. Elias looked at this woman and this child on his porch steps in the morning sun, and something happened in him that he didn't have a word for and didn't need one. "They'll come back," he said. "I know," Maggie said. "A deputy means Gerald's got money and reach. He'll try again." Elias was thinking out loud partly. "You can't make Harlan's Creek in the wagon in the state it's in. Not for 3 more days at least. And even then, if he sent men to the roads. I know, Maggie said again. There was no self-pity in it. Just the frank assessment of a woman counting resources. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Stay, he said. She blinked. Not just until the wagon's fixed, he said. Stay until we figure out how to move you safely. I know the back routes through this country better than any deputy Gerald Cole could hire. I know which ranchers will let you pass without talking about it, and which ones will run to the first badge they see for the reward money. He paused. I can get you to your sister, but not in 3 days, and not on the main road. Maggie stared at him. You don't owe us anything, she said. You have already done more than. I'm not doing it because I owe you, Elias said. I'm doing it because it's right. He said it simply. No drama in it. The way a man states a fact he's already decided is not negotiable. Nora looked up at her mother. Maggie looked at Elias for a long moment. Long enough that the silence between them became something with texture, something that held the weight of the previous night, and the breakfast table, and the porch, and the stars, and all the things that neither of them had said directly, but that had been said anyway. All right, she said. All right. And then, for just a moment, she let herself look at him, the way a woman looks at a man when she's stopped pretending she isn't. It was there and gone before she could control it, quick as a breath, but Elias caught it, and it hit him somewhere behind the ribs with a force that startled him. He turned away before she could see what it did to his face. He went to the forge. He worked the iron. He hit it while it was hot because he was learning finally at 40 years old in the hardest possible way that the thing about hot metal is true. Hot metal moves. Cold metal breaks. And maybe that was true for people too. The third day changed everything. It started like the first 2 early quiet practical. Elias was at the forge by sunrise. Maggie was in the garden pulling weeds she'd noticed on the second day. Nora was in the barn telling his horses something in a low, serious voice that he couldn't make out, but that the horses appeared to find credible. Then, at mid-morning, Elias's nearest neighbor rode in. Thomas Birch was 63 years old, had ranched the property 8 miles east for 32 years, and was one of the 4 people in Blue Creek Valley that Elias would describe if pressed as someone he didn't mind talking to. He rode in on his big sorrel pulled up in the yard and looked from Elias at the forge to Maggie in the garden to Nora, visible in the barn doorway, and his expression did several complicated things in quick succession. Elias walked over. Tom, he said. Elias. Thomas Birch did not stop looking at the yard, with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he understood. You've got people. I've got guests, Elias said. Their wagon broke in the storm. I'm doing the repair. Thomas looked at him. 2 deputies came through my place this morning, he said, dropping his voice. Looking for a woman and a girl. Said a businessman from Billings sent them. He paused. They asked if I'd seen anything on the Blue Creek Road. Elias waited. I told them no, Thomas said. Elias let out a breath. They're gonna come back to your place, son, Thomas said. That deputy Renner, his name is, he's not the kind that gives up easy. I've seen him work before. He'll get a federal letter if he has to. Husbands have rights under the law, and he knows how to use them. I know, Elias said. Thomas looked at Maggie, who had stood up from the garden and was watching them from a distance with the focused stillness of someone trying to read the conversation from 20 yards away. He looked back at Elias. What are you going to do? Thomas asked. Move them, Elias said. Through the back country. I know the way to Harlan's Creek that doesn't touch any main road. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's 4 days of hard riding. I know. You'd be leaving the ranch. I know. Thomas looked at him for a long time. This woman, he said, not accusatory, not even curious exactly, more like a man making an observation he already knows the answer to. She means something to you. Elias didn't answer immediately. I thought about the barn and the storm, and 2 words that carried more weight than they should. He thought about a kitchen table with 3 chairs and a child asking whether hot metal was like people. He thought about stars and something said about fear not being allowed to drive. It doesn't matter, he said finally. She needs help. That's enough. Thomas looked at him the way old men look at younger ones who are lying to themselves but haven't been lying long enough to make it convincing. "All right," Thomas said. "I'll keep my eyes open. If Renner comes back through, I'll send my boy to warn you. That'll give you an hour, maybe two." "That's all I need," Elias said. Thomas tipped his hat, looked one more time at the yard full of people, this yard that had been empty and silent for 11 years, and rode back the way he'd come. Elias stood for a moment where he was. Then he walked over to Maggie. She was already looking at him when he reached her, because she'd been watching him the whole time, and she was not a woman who missed the shape of a conversation just because she couldn't hear the words. "We're leaving tomorrow," he said, "before dawn." She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just said, "Tell me what to pack." And then Nora's voice came from the barn doorway, clear and carrying. "I told the horses we might be going somewhere." The gray one seemed excited. The brown one seemed worried. "I think I know how they both feel." Elias looked at this girl. And despite everything, the deputy and the husband in Billings, and the thing that was building in him that he didn't know what to do with, he laughed. Actually laughed a real sound rough from disuse, surprised out of him entirely against his will. Maggie looked at him when he laughed. She looked at him the way she had on the porch, that quick, unguarded, immediately controlled look. But this time, she didn't pull it back quite fast enough. And this time, he didn't look away. He let it exist for one full second between them. That look, that thing with no name hanging in the warm summer air between the barn and the garden on his ranch in Blue Creek Valley. Then Nora came running out of the barn toward them, done with her horse consultations, and ready for lunch, and the moment broke into the ordinary, and they let it. But it had happened. Both of them knew it. And now there was no putting it back. They left before the sky had any color in it. Elias had the horses ready by 4 in the morning, his mare a steady trail gelding. He trusted on rough ground and the spare roan that could carry the packed supplies without complaint. He'd been up since 2, moving through the dark house with a lantern turned low, filling saddlebags, rolling blankets tight, choosing what mattered and what didn't. He'd done it before, packing for long rides into the backcountry, but never for anyone but himself, and the difference in the weight of that packing for 3 instead of 1 was something he felt in his hands without fully understanding why. Maggie was awake when he knocked softly on the guest room door. She answered it, already dressed, her hair pulled back and her satchel over her shoulder. Nora standing behind her with boots already laced, and her mouth set in the determined line that meant she'd decided to be brave about something and wasn't going to discuss it. "Ready," Maggie said. He nodded. They went out into the dark. He'd told them the route the night before, spread out across the kitchen table with a hand-drawn map he'd made from memory, because he knew this country the way he knew his own hands, and no cartographer had bothered to draw the trails he was thinking of. The back route to Harlan's Creek went northwest through the high meadows. Above, Blue Creek dropped into a river valley that most people didn't know existed, skirted the edge of Crow territory, where any deputy with sense wouldn't follow, and came out on the far side of the Harlan Range through a pass that was only usable in summer, and only by people who'd been through it before. He had been through it before. Twice. Both times alone, both times for reasons that no longer mattered. It would take 4 days. Maybe 5 if the river was still running high after the storm. What it would not do was take them anywhere near a main road to town, or any route that Deputy Renner and his partner would think to watch. They rode out of the yard in single file, Elias at the front, Nora in the middle on the trail, gelding with her small hands steady on the reins. She'd told him she could ride, and she'd been telling the truth, and Maggie behind with the roan on a lead line. The ranch fell away behind them in the dark, and Elias did not look back at it, because looking back at things was a habit he'd spent a long time breaking. They rode in silence for the first hour. Not uncomfortable silence, purposeful silence, the kind that comes when people are paying attention to the ground and the dark and the sounds that matter. Nora was the first to speak, because Nora was always the first to speak, when a silence had gone on long enough for her to have thought of something worth saying. "How do you know where you're going?" she asked. "You can't see anything." "I know the feel of the ground," Elias said. "The slope of it. The way the air changes when you're near water. You can feel the slope. Through the horse. She leans a certain way. You can feel it in your legs if you're paying attention." A pause. Then, Can you teach me that? Maybe, he said. Give it a few days. He heard from somewhere behind him the quiet sound of Maggie exhaling, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something between the two that meant she was listening, and it was doing something to her that she wasn't going to comment on. He kept his eyes forward, and his mare at a steady walk, and he thought about nothing except the ground, and the dark, and the route he'd already mapped in his head a dozen times before dawn. They made good time through the morning. The high meadow trail was firm after the storm, wet enough to hold the hoofprints, but not soft enough to drag at the horse's feet. By the time the sun was fully up, they'd covered 8 miles and were into the timber above the main valley, where the tree cover was thick and the trail dropped away from any sightline someone watching from below might have. He called a halt at a creek to water the horses and let Nora eat the biscuits Maggie had wrapped in cloth the night before. They didn't build a fire. They didn't stay long. "You think they'll look for us today?" Maggie asked while the horses drank. "Renner'll go back to the ranch first," Elias said. "When he finds it empty, he'll start looking at the roads. It'll take him half a day to realize we're not on any road he knows." He looked at her. "By the time he figures out there's a back route, we'll be past the river. After that, even if he had a guide, he couldn't catch us before Harlan's Creek." Maggie absorbed this. "And if he has a guide, there's nobody in Blue Creek Valley who knows this route except me," Elias said. "And Tom Birch. And Tom won't tell him." She nodded, but she was still working through something. He could see it in the way her jaw was set. "Gerald has money," she said. "He can hire whoever he needs. He can get a federal marshal involved if he wants. Legally—" She stopped. "Legally, I don't have much ground to stand on. A wife leaving it's not illegal for him to send people after us." "No," Elias said. "It's not." She looked at him. "So what happens when we get to Harlan's Creek? He'll find us eventually. My sister's address isn't a secret." He'd been thinking about this since the night before, working it the same way he worked. Problems at the forge, turning it in the heat, looking at the shape of it, finding where the weak spots were. "Your sister," he said. "Does she have a husband?" "She does. Carl Whitmore. He's a good man. He was a lawyer before they moved out west." Something moved behind Elias's eyes. "What kind of lawyer?" "Civil matters mostly. Contracts. Property." She paused. "Why?" "Because a wife leaving a husband isn't a crime," Elias said. "But it's also not a clean situation in most territories. What Gerald's relying on is that you don't have anyone who knows the law on your side. If your sister's husband does—" "Carl could help us," Maggie said. She was following it now, the logic of it, and he watched the calculation move across her face. "He's been saying for 2 years that he knew people in the territorial government. He said Gerald Cole wasn't as untouchable as he believed himself to be." She stopped. "He said Gerald had been involved in land dealings that weren't clean. That there were people who'd be interested in that information if someone ever chose to bring it." Elias looked at her. "You never said anything about that," he said. "I didn't know if it was true," she said. "I didn't want to. I didn't want to make Gerald an enemy on a rumor. I just wanted to leave quietly." Her voice tightened briefly, then steadied. "He didn't let me do it quietly." Nora had finished her biscuits and was sitting on a rock, watching both of them with the attentiveness of a child who understood more than she was supposed to. "So Gerald made a mistake," Elias said. "What mistake?" "Sending deputies after you," he said. "He made you a problem that needs solving publicly, and that means Carl's information stops being a rumor and starts being leverage." Maggie stared at him. "You think like a chess player," she said. "I think like a man who fixes broken things," he said. "You find the crack and you work from there." She was quiet for a moment, then very quietly. "He's not going to let us go, Elias." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "He's not." "So what do we do?" "We get to Harlan's Creek," he said. "We get to your sister and Carl. And then we stop running, and we turn around, and we face him. But we do it on ground we choose with people we trust, with every piece of information Carl has ready to use." He paused. "Gerald Cole is used to people backing down. He's not used to someone coming back at him with something he can't buy his way out of." The creek ran between them, and the silence held for a moment. Then Nora said from her rock, I think that's the right plan. The gray horse agreed with me this morning, and I think she'd agree with this too." Maggie made a sound that was more laugh than cry, and pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, and then composed herself with the practiced speed of a woman who'd learned not to fall apart in front of her daughter. Elias turned back to the horses. He didn't comment on the sound she'd made. He just untied the horses and said, "We should move," and they moved. They made camp that night beside the river. It was running high but not dangerously. The storm had pushed it up and it moved fast over the rocks with a steady roar that covered sound well, which mattered. Elias built a fire small enough to not send much light above the tree canopy. They ate dried venison and hard biscuits, and the last of the apples from the ranch, and the river talked over everything, and Nora fell asleep between them, with her head on the rolled blanket before she'd finished her supper. Elias and Maggie sat on opposite sides of the fire after. It was the first time in 3 days they'd been alone, truly alone without the ranch around them, and the work between them, and the logical reasons to focus on something other than each other. The river made everything feel private. The dark pressed in warm and close. "You didn't have to come with us," Maggie said. She wasn't accusing him. She was making space for truth the way she always did, opening a door and waiting to see if he'd walk through it. "I wanted to," he said. "Why?" He turned the question over. There was a version of the answer that was simple and safe, because it was right, because she needed help, because any decent man would. He'd said versions of that before. It was even partly true. But this woman had been sleeping in his guest room for 3 days, and had sat on his porch in the starlight, and told him fear wasn't allowed to drive, and had looked at him twice in ways that had hit him somewhere past the ribs, and he'd spent enough years being precise and honest about everything else in his life, that lying to her now felt like the worst possible thing he could do. "Because I didn't want you to leave," he said. The fire crackled. The river ran. Maggie didn't move. She sat perfectly still with her hands around her coffee cup, and she didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her. "Elias," she said, very quietly. "I know," he said. "I know what I am. I'm a 40-year-old man who spent 20 years deciding he wasn't built for this. I know that. I'm not asking you for anything. I just..." He stopped. Tried again. "I just wanted you to know it was true. That's all." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not what you think you are," she said. "What do you mean?" "You think you're the man who chose the mountains over people," she said. "You think that's who you are. But what I've seen for 3 days is a man who fixed our wagon and fed us and lied to a deputy without blinking to protect us, and is now riding 4 days into the back country on our behalf." She paused. "That's not a man who doesn't care about people. That's a man who cares so much it terrifies him." I didn't have an answer for that. It landed in him like a thrown stone, finding water. The impact immediate, the ripples moving outward through every quiet corner of him. "You've been watching me," he said finally. "I've been watching you," she confirmed, simply. "The same way you've been watching me." The admission sat between them warm and dangerous, and more honest than anything he'd said in years. He should have said something then. He could feel it the moment the open door, the specific type of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that asks a person to step through something instead of around it. But before he could, the sound came. A branch, snapping clean. Not the creak, not the wind. Something deliberate, something with weight behind it, moving through the timber 30 yards west of camp. Elias was on his feet before Maggie had processed what she'd heard. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the log beside him. He'd brought it from the ranch without explaining why, without making it a thing, and she hadn't asked. Now she understood. He held up one hand still, and she froze. Nora slept on. He moved away from the firelight, stepping sideways into the dark, and he stood absolutely still and listened. Another sound. Closer. The specific creak of a saddle. Someone was out there on horseback. Moving slow. Trying to be quiet. Trying and not quite making it, which meant either they were amateur or they wanted to be heard enough to give him a chance to respond before this became something worse. "Hello, the camp," a voice called out. Male, rough, cautious. Elias raised the rifle. "Stay where you are," he said. "State your name. A pause. Then, "My name's Will Cord. I ride for Tom Birch. He sent me." Everything in Elias recalibrated in 1 second. He lowered the rifle a degree. "Come in slow," he said. "Hands where I can see them." A young man rode into the firelight. Maybe 20, lean and sun-dark, with his hands raised and his eyes wide, with the specific expression of someone who has just realized that the man holding a rifle in the dark is not someone to be casual around. "Mr. Birch sent me," the boy said again. "He said to find you before tomorrow morning. He said it was urgent." Elias lowered the rifle fully. Behind him, he heard Maggie let out a breath. "What's the message?" he said. Will Cord dismounted, slow and deliberate. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Renner came back to the Blue Creek Ranch," he said. "Like you figured. But he didn't just look around. He talked to people in Callaway. He found out about the wagon. He found out a rancher had done the repair." He paused. "And someone in Callaway, Mr. Birch, didn't know who told Renner about the back pass." The cold in Elias's chest was immediate and precise. "Someone told him about the pass," he said. "Yes, sir." Will Cord held out the folded paper. Mr. Birch wrote down what he heard. He said Renner's heading north with 4 men now, not 2, 4. And he's not just a county deputy anymore. He paused. "He's got a federal letter, a husband's rights claim signed by a judge in Billings. It gives him legal authority to bring them back." Elias took the paper. He didn't open it. He stood very still for a moment. Maggie had come to stand beside him. He could feel her there without looking, the specific weight of her presence, the particular quality of her stillness when she was containing something large. "He got a federal letter," she said. "Not a question. Gerald has friends," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "I knew he would. I just didn't think he'd move this fast." She paused. "He's not coming back because he loves us. He's coming back because no one leaves Gerald Cole. That's the thing. For him, it's not about us. It's about what it looks like." Elias turned to look at her. Her face was steady, but her hands, she'd crossed them against her chest, pressed flat, that contained gesture. He'd learned to read. Her hands were working against each other in a way that told him everything. The steadiness of her face was trying not to show. "How far ahead of them are we?" he asked Will Cord. "Mr. Birch reckons you've got 6 hours, the boy said. "Maybe 8 if they camp. But Renner doesn't camp if he doesn't have to. He'll push through the night." 6 hours. Elias ran the route in his head. The pass was still 2 days out at the pace they'd been keeping. Even pushing hard, even pushing harder than was safe on backcountry trail in the dark, they couldn't make the pass in 6 hours. But there was something else. Something he'd been saving in the back of his mind without knowing he'd need it. "There's a homestead," he said, 14 miles north. "A woman named Ruth Calder. She's been there since '68, before anyone else was in this valley. She knows the terrain better than I do, and she knows Crow people who pass through her land." He paused. "Renner won't follow us into Crow territory. Not with a federal letter. Federal law doesn't carry much weight out there, and he knows it." "You're talking about going through Crow territory," Maggie said. "I'm talking about going to Ruth first," he said. "She'll know if the passage is safe right now. She'll know if there are people who'll let us through." He looked at Maggie. "It adds a day, but it takes Renner completely off our trail." Maggie looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Nora, still asleep by the fire face, peaceful and unaware of federal letters and 4-man parties pushing through the backcountry in the dark. "Let's go to Ruth," she said. He turned to Will Cord. "Can you ride back to Birch tonight?" "Yes, sir." "Tell him what I told you. Tell him we're going north to the Calder homestead. If Renner comes back through Tom, doesn't know anything about a north route. He doesn't know Ruth Calder exists. He doesn't know anything except that he hasn't seen us." Will Cord nodded seriously. "Yes, sir." "And tell him," Elias paused. "Tell him I'll owe him one." "He said you'd say that," Will Cord said. "He also said to tell you, and I'm just repeating his words, that you've been keeping that particular debt uncollected for 11 years, and it's about time something made you spend it." Despite everything, the cold calculation of 6 hours and 4 men and a federal letter, the corner of Elias's mouth moved. "Tell him he's a pain in the neck," he said. Will Cord almost smiled. He remounted, touched his hat, and disappeared back into the dark the way he'd come. Elias turned to the fire. He kicked dirt over it smooth and practiced not enough to make smoke, just enough to kill the light. He looked at Nora, who had slept through all of it. "We need to wake her," he said. Maggie was already crouching beside her daughter, one hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Nora, sweetheart, we have to ride." The girl came awake, the way she did everything quietly and immediately, eyes open and present before her body had fully remembered where it was. She looked at her mother's face and read it. "We have to go fast," she said. "We have to go fast," Maggie said. Nora sat up, reached for her boots. "Okay," she said. "No questions, no complaints, just okay." Elias watched this girl pull on her boots in the dark beside a killed fire, while 4 men with a federal letter pushed through the mountains behind them, and the thing in his chest that had been building since a storm and a barn door, and 2 words that weighed too much, reached a point that he recognized, even if he didn't say it, even if he wasn't ready to say it. He saddled the horses faster than he'd ever saddled them. They rode north into the dark. The next 7 hours were the hardest riding Elias had done in years. The trail above the river was narrow and technical, requiring the kind of constant attention that doesn't leave room for thinking about anything else. Every step of the horses deliberate, every switchback negotiated carefully, every water crossing checked before they went in. He rode at the front, feeling the ground through his mare, the way he'd told Nora, reading the slope, and the sound, and the air, and he did not stop except twice briefly to listen to the dark behind them. The second time he stopped to listen, Maggie came up beside him. "Anything?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. Not yet. She was close enough that he could see her face in the moonlight that came through the trees in pieces. She was tired. Bone tired, the kind that comes from 3 days of sustained tension, on top of years of sustained tension, but her eyes were clear and focused, and she was holding herself in the saddle with a straight back and a lifted chin, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him for its simplicity. "This is the most remarkable woman I have ever been near." He didn't say that. He looked back at this trail and said, "Another hour and we'll be above the timberline. After that it's easier ground." She nodded, fell back to her position. He rode on. Ruth Calder's homestead appeared out of the morning, just as the sun was clearing the eastern peaks, a low, solid structure built from the mountain itself. It seemed fitted so well into the landscape that you could ride within 100 yards of it and not see it unless you knew it was there. Elias had been here twice. The first time Ruth had met him at the door with a shotgun. The second time she'd offered him coffee. He considered both visits successful. He called out before they reached the yard. "Ruth Calder, it's Elias Holt from Blue Creek. I've got people with me, and I need your help." A silence. Then a door opened. Ruth Calder was somewhere between 60 and ancient. It was genuinely difficult to tell, and she did not encourage guessing. She was small and dark-eyed, and moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned long ago that the world rewarded carefulness. She looked at Elias. She looked at Maggie. She looked at Nora, who looked back at her with complete seriousness. "Who's after you?" Ruth said. To Elias. "County deputy with a federal letter and 3 hired men," Elias said. "Her husband. She left him." Ruth's eyes moved to Maggie. "He hurt you," Ruth said. Directly. The way Elias had asked it, not an accusation, just a question that needed answering. "Yes," Maggie said. "Not in ways that leave marks, but yes." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on. You can tell me the shape of it, and I'll tell you what I can do." They went inside. And it was in Ruth Calder's kitchen an hour later, with coffee in his hands, and the exhaustion of the night's ride settling into his bones, that Elias heard the thing that changed the entire shape of what he thought he was dealing with. Ruth knew people. She had lived in this territory for 19 years, and she had built relationships across every boundary that other settlers treated as walls, with Crow families who passed through seasonal territory, with trappers who knew the mountains better than maps did, with the occasional federal man who was decent enough to drink coffee with before conducting his business. She had ears everywhere that mattered, and she was not shy about using them. "Gerald Cole," she said. The name came out of her mouth with a weight that made everyone at the table go still. "You know him," Elias said. "I know of him," Ruth said. "He's been buying up land throughout the Billings territory for 5 years. Not openly, he uses men in the middle shell purchases names that don't trace back to him directly." She set down her cup. "He's been after a land parcel in the Harlan's Creek area for 2 years. A parcel that the current owners won't sell." Maggie set down her own cup, very carefully. "My sister," Maggie said. "Her husband Carl. They own land in Harlan's Creek." Ruth looked at her steadily. "What kind of land?" "It sits on the North River approach," Maggie said slowly. "Carl always said it was good timberland. And there's water. A year-round spring." Ruth nodded once. "There's a railroad survey coming through next summer," she said. "The Harlan route. Anyone who controls the North River approach controls the most viable path for the line. That land will be worth 20 times what it is now when the survey goes public." The table was silent. Elias felt something cold and precise settle into place the way pieces do when you stop looking at them separately and see the pattern they make together. "Gerald didn't send men after you because he was angry," he said. He was looking at Maggie and saying it slowly, working it out as he said it. "He sent men after you because you were going to your sister. Because you arriving at Carl's house with whatever you know and whatever you might tell him would put Carl on guard," Maggie said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "Carl would know something was wrong. He'd start looking. He'd find what Gerald's been doing." She stopped. "Gerald isn't coming after me because I'm his wife. He's coming after me because I'm a liability." The word landed in the room like a stone. Nora, sitting beside her mother, said nothing. But she reached out under the table and found her mother's hand, and Maggie gripped it without looking down. Elias looked at Ruth. "Can you get us to Harlan's Creek?" he said. "Through the territory, so Renner can't follow." Ruth considered this for a long moment. "I can get a message to the Crow family that runs the Eastern Passage," she said. "They know me. They'll let you through if I ask." She paused. "It'll take a day to get the message there and back. You'll have to stay here until tomorrow." "Can we stay here safely?" Elias said. "If Renner's north." "Renner won't come here," Ruth said flatly. "Everyone in these mountains knows this homestead is not a place a man rides into uninvited and rides out again in good health. Renner's heard of me. He'll look everywhere else before he comes here, and by the time he considers it, you'll be gone." She said it without pride. Just as a fact, the way she said everything. Elias looked at Maggie. Maggie looked back at him. The thing he'd said last night beside the fire, "I didn't want you to leave," was still hanging between them. Unfinished, the door still open, and neither of them having walked through it yet. But there was something different in her eyes now from last night. Something past the tiredness and the fear and the calculation. Something that was looking at him the way a person looks at the one thing that has remained steady while everything else has moved. "All right," he said, to Ruth, "we'll stay." He turned back to his coffee. And under the table where he couldn't see it, Maggie's hand was still holding Nora's. And Nora very quietly, very carefully reached her other hand across the underside of the table and found Elias's knee and patted it twice the way a child does when they want to say something they don't have a word for yet. He looked down. Then he looked at the girl. She was looking at her coffee cup with tremendous concentration, as though she had not just done anything at all. He looked back at his own cup. And for the first time in a very long time, in a strange woman's kitchen in the back country of Montana, with 4 men somewhere in the mountains behind them, and the hardest part of the road still ahead. Elias Holt felt something he had spent 40 years and 11 in the mountains, convincing himself he didn't need. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They stayed at Ruth Calder's homestead through the rest of that day, and the night that followed, and in that time, Elias learned something about stillness that he hadn't known before, that there are 2 kinds of it. the kind he'd lived in for 11 years, which was the stillness of a man who had stopped expecting anything, and the kind that settled over Ruth's homestead that afternoon, which was the stillness of people waiting for something they believed was still possible. The difference between those two things was not small. Ruth sent her message through a crowboy, who appeared at the homestead shortly after noon appeared being the right word, because Elias hadn't heard or seen him coming, and he prided himself on hearing things coming. The boy was maybe 14 with dark, quiet eyes, and the kind of self-possession that made Nora watch him with frank admiration from across the yard. Ruth spoke to him briefly in a mix of languages that Elias caught only pieces of. The boy nodded, once, looked at the three of them, looked longest at Nora, who looked straight back at him without flinching, and then left the same way he'd come, without sound. "Tomorrow morning," Ruth said. "If the answer is yes, he'll be back before sunrise." "And if the answer is no?" Maggie asked. "It won't be no," Ruth said. "I haven't asked them for much in 19 years. When I do ask, they listen." She went back inside without further explanation, and that was the end of the conversation. Elias spent the afternoon doing what he always did when his hands were free and his mind was not. He found work. Ruth's fence line on the east side had a section that had been stressed by something large moving through it, and he spent 2 hours repairing it with tools from her shed, while Maggie helped Ruth preserve the last of a vegetable harvest in the root cellar, and Nora followed the crowboy's route with her eyes until there was nothing left to follow, and then turned her attention to a litter of half-grown cats living under Ruth's porch. It was ordinary, painfully, achingly ordinary. And underneath the ordinary, every one of them was counting the hours. Elias was back at the fence tightening the last wire when Maggie appeared beside him. She didn't announce herself. She just came and stood there the way she'd learned to exist near him, without ceremony, without preamble, as if she'd been standing next to him for years instead of days. "Carl wrote me a letter 6 months ago," she said. "He didn't send it through the regular mail because he knew Gerald monitored the post. He sent it through a woman who ran a dry goods store inside a package of thread. It took me 3 weeks to find it." Elias kept his hands on the wire. "What did it say?" "He'd found records," Maggie said. "Shell companies. Gerald's name buried 3 layers deep purchases made on land parcels that shouldn't have been available for purchase because the previous owners hadn't agreed to sell." She paused. "He said 2 of those previous owners had left the territory suddenly. One of them left owing debts that Carl thought were manufactured. The other one—" She stopped. "The other one," Elias said. "Carl wasn't sure," she said. "He said he didn't want to say the word until he was sure." The wire held tight in his hands. He looked at her. "Maggie, how dangerous is Gerald Cole?" She met his eyes without looking away. "I lived in his house for 9 years, she said. "I watched him smile at people he was destroying. I watched him donate money to causes in public while he was burning those same causes down in private." She paused. "He is the most dangerous kind of person, the kind that everyone believes is good." Elias thought about Renner and 4 men and a federal letter and someone in Callaway who'd talked about the pass. "We can't just get you to Harlan's Creek," he said. "Getting there isn't enough. Gerald will follow you there. He'll pressure Carl, find a way to tie Carl up legally, freeze whatever information Carl has. He's got the resources and the reach to make it take years." "I know," Maggie said. "I've been thinking about it since Ruth told us about the railroad survey. And there's a Territorial Land Commission meeting in Helena in 3 weeks, she said. Carl mentioned it in the letter. He said if he could get the right documents in front of the right people at that meeting, Gerald's land scheme would be finished. Not delayed. Finished. Because the commission has the authority to void fraudulent purchases and the federal oversight to back it up. She looked at him steadily. But Carl needs what he has, plus something Gerald doesn't know anyone has. What doesn't Gerald know anyone has? Maggie reached into her coat, the inside pocket close against her body, the place where a person keeps the thing they are most afraid to lose. She drew out a folded document creased and worn at the edges from being handled too many times and held it out to him. He took it, opened it. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 14 months ago. And it was written in a hand he didn't recognize, addressed to someone he didn't recognize, discussing the purchase of a land parcel, in terms that were technical and careful, and unmistakably the language of a man arranging something he knew was wrong. At the bottom, a signature. Gerald A. Cole. Elias looked up. "Where did you get this?" he said. "His desk," Maggie said. "The morning we left. I went through his desk while he was at his club, and I took everything that looked like it mattered. I didn't know what most of it was. I just knew that a man like Gerald keeps the things that can hurt him closer than anything else." She paused. "I found 4 letters like that one. They're all in my satchel. I've been carrying them since Billings." Elias stared at her. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had been waiting to exhale for 6 days. "You've been carrying the evidence the entire time," he said. "Yes." "The entire time Renner's been chasing you?" "Yes." "Maggie." He stopped, started again. "If Renner had caught you." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why he couldn't catch us." The fence wire was still in his hand. He became aware of it distantly, the way a person becomes aware of something they've been gripping hard when their hand starts to ache. He set it down carefully. He looked at this woman standing in the afternoon light of a homestead in the Montana backcountry. A woman who had walked out of a dangerous man's house with 4 incriminating letters pressed against her heart, who had driven a wagon alone through a storm with her daughter beside her, who had stood on his porch steps and said, "We're all right," without flinching. And he thought, "I have been wrong about what strength looks like for a very long time." "Does Carl know you have these?" he asked. "No," she said. "I didn't know if the letters would reach him safely. I didn't know if Gerald was watching his mail. I thought the safest thing was to carry them and say nothing until I could put them in Carl's hands myself." "That was the right call," Elias said. "Was it?" She said it without self-pity, but with the genuine weight of someone who had been carrying a decision alone for too long and wasn't entirely sure it had been the right one. "I put Nora in danger. I put you in danger. If Gerald knows what I took—" "He suspects," Elias said. "That's why Renner has 4 men instead of 2, and a federal letter instead of just a county badge." He looked at her. "He doesn't know exactly what you have, but he knows you have something, and he needs it back before Helena." Maggie absorbed this. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he confirmed. "We've got time. Barely, but we've got it." She folded the letter and put it back inside her coat against her body, where it had lived for 6 days. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "You told me when you were ready," he said. "That's soon enough." She looked at him for a moment with something in her eyes that was too complicated to name and too clear to misread. Then Ruth called from the house that supper was ready, and the moment folded itself into the ordinary, and they went inside. That night, after Nora was asleep, and Ruth had retired with the spare brevity of a woman who treated sleep as a practical matter rather than a pleasure, Elias and Maggie sat at Ruth's kitchen table, with the lamp turned low and the 4 letters spread between them. He read each one carefully. She watched him read them, and he was aware of her watching, and neither of them commented on it. When he'd finished, he lined them up in order of date and looked at the sequence of what they revealed. It was a careful, patient fraud, built over 5 years, shell purchases, false deeds, pressure applied to landowners through debt, and legal maneuvering, all of it pointing toward a single goal that became clearer with each letter. The railroad survey. The North River approach. Carl and Helen Whitmore's land, sitting square in the middle of what would become, when the survey went public, the most valuable corridor in the territory. "He's been building this for years," Elias said. "Gerald builds everything slowly," Maggie said. "He's patient. It's his best quality and his worst one." She paused. "He was patient with me too at the beginning. That's how I didn't see what he was for a long time. By the time I understood, I was already inside it." "He underestimated you," Elias said. She looked at him. "A man like that always does," he said. "With everyone. It's what makes him dangerous, and it's what makes him beatable. He doesn't account for people being more than what he decides they are." Maggie looked at the letters on the table, then at him. "He didn't account for me taking these." "No," Elias said. "He didn't. And he didn't account for me finding someone who would help me get them to Carl." The sentence sat between them with more weight than its words. He didn't answer it directly, but he held her eyes for a moment that stretched past the point of accident, past the point of ordinary, into something that both of them had been edging toward since a storm and a barn door, and the particular honesty of a woman who didn't let fear drive. Then he gathered the letters, carefully folded them, and handed them back to her. "Keep them inside your coat," he said, "until Carl has them in his hands." She took them. Her fingers brushed his in the exchange brief, barely the kind of contact that in another context would mean nothing. In this one, it meant everything neither of them had said yet. She tucked the letters away. "Elias," she said. "Yeah. When this is over—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "When Nora and I are in Harlan's Creek, and Carl has what he needs, and Gerald is finished, what happens to you?" He hadn't let himself think about it. He'd been keeping his mind on the practical, the route, the letters, the timing, the 3 weeks before Helena, because the practical was safe, and the alternative was not. "I go back to Blue Creek," he said. "Ranch doesn't run itself." She nodded, like that was what she'd expected him to say, like she was tucking that answer away somewhere alongside the letters carrying it. "All right," she said quietly. He looked at the lamp. "Maggie," he said. "Yes." He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. She always was. He'd come to realize, not in a manner of surveillance, but in the manner of someone who found it difficult to look anywhere else and had stopped pretending otherwise. "What I said by the fire," he said, "about not wanting you to leave." "I remember," she said. "I meant it then, and I mean it now," he said. "I just—" He stopped. This was the part of things he'd never been good at. Words for the interior of himself. Words for the things that happened behind his ribs, rather than in front of them. "I've been alone a long time. Long enough that I'd convinced myself it was by choice. You showed me in about 3 days that it wasn't choice. It was just fear with a better story." Maggie said nothing. She was watching him the way she watched things that mattered. "I don't know what I'm asking," he said. "I'm not asking anything. I just wanted you to know that you changed something. In me. Something I didn't think could be changed." He paused. "That matters to me. You matter to me. Both of you." The lamp flame moved. Outside, the Montana backcountry was completely dark and completely silent. Maggie reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not tentative. Not asking. Just placing it there the way you put your hand on something solid when the ground isn't certain. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a long time without speaking, because some things don't need words, and both of them had learned in their different ways to recognize those things when they found them. The Crowboy came back before sunrise, as Ruth had said he would. He appeared at the door, spoke briefly to Ruth, and was gone again before Elias had finished saddling the horses. Ruth came to find him in the barn with the answer in her face before she said it. "The passage is open," she said. "2 of their people will ride the boundary with you. Not as guides, they know you can find your own way, but as a visible presence. Any man with a federal letter who sees you flanked by Crow riders in Crow territory will stop and think very hard before following." "Ruth," Elias said. "I don't know how to—" "Don't," she said. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because that woman and her girl deserve better than what's chasing them, and because you—" She stopped, looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen 19 years of this country and everything it contained. "Because it's good to see you with people, Elias. It always should have been this way." He didn't have anything to say to that either. He finished saddling the horses. They rode out in the early gray, and true to Ruth's word, 2 riders appeared from the timber at the edge of the first rise, quiet, steady, positioned exactly where they would be visible to anyone watching from the trail behind. Nora looked at them with enormous eyes and did not speak, which was how Elias knew she was truly impressed. The passage through the territory took most of the day. It was hard country, not impossible, but demanding the kind of riding that required constant attention and left no space for anything except the immediate. Elias rode at the front, reading the ground, choosing the best line, and he fell into the focused silence of it with the ease of long practice. But he was aware in a way he had not been aware of anything in 11 years of the two people riding behind him. They came out on the eastern side of the Crow territory in the late afternoon, at a point where the trail met a proper road for the first time in 3 days. Their two escorts stopped at the boundary without ceremony and turned back without looking at them again. Elias raised one hand in acknowledgement. They were already gone. Nora watched the empty place where they'd been. "I want to learn what they know," she said. "Then you'd better pay attention for the rest of your life," Elias said. "Because that kind of knowledge takes all of it." She seemed to find this an acceptable answer and turned her horse forward. Harlan's Creek was 6 miles east. They could make it before dark. They rode the last 6 miles in a different kind of quiet than the backcountry, the quiet of something ending, which is never the same as the quiet of something continuing, and all three of them felt the difference without naming it. When the town came into view, Nora let out a breath. When they reached the main street, Maggie said, "Helen's house is on the north end, past the church." When they turned north on the main street of Harlan's Creek, a woman came running out of a house 2 blocks ahead. Dark-haired, younger than Maggie, with the same bone structure and the same way of holding herself currently, holding none of herself back whatsoever, as she ran down the street toward them without any apparent concern for what anyone watching might think. "Maggie," the woman called out. "Maggie, I got word you were coming. I got word 3 hours ago from a man who—" She pulled up short when she saw Elias, looked at him, looked at her sister, looked at Nora, looked back at Elias with the specific expression of a woman performing rapid and fairly accurate calculation. "Helen," Maggie said, dismounting. "This is Elias Holt. He brought us from Blue Creek, through the back country." Helen Whitmore looked at Elias. "Through the back country," she repeated. "Through Crow territory," Nora added helpfully. Helen's expression completed its calculation and arrived at a conclusion that she kept to herself. She stepped forward, reached up, and gripped Elias's hand where it rested on the saddle horn. "Thank you," she said, the 2 words that had weight. "I'd have done it for anyone," he said. "No," she said. "You wouldn't have." She said it plainly, the way a woman says something she knows to be true, because she can see the evidence of it right in front of her. "But thank you for saying that too." Carl Whitmore was waiting inside a lean, careful-looking man with a lawyer's eyes that catalogued everything immediately and a warmth that came through anyway. He gripped Elias's hand in the hallway and said, "Tom Birch sent a rider ahead. We know about Renner." "Then you know about the letters," Maggie said. Carl went still. "What letters?" Maggie reached inside her coat. She laid 4 folded documents on Carl's kitchen table. Carl sat down. He read them the way Elias had, slowly in order, with the expression of a man watching a pattern emerge from what had appeared to be random. When he finished, he looked up. His face had done something complicated and arrived somewhere very focused. "Maggie," he said, "do you know what you're holding?" "I know it's enough," she said. "It's more than enough," Carl said. "One of these names." He pointed to the second letter. "This man is on the Territorial Land Commission. He's been on Gerald's payroll, and nobody could prove it. This letter proves it." He looked at her. "This isn't just enough to stop Gerald's railroad scheme. This is enough to put him in front of a federal court." The kitchen was silent. Nora, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water that Helen had pressed into her hands, looked at her mother. Maggie looked at Carl. "Then we use them," she said. "The commission meeting is in 3 weeks," Carl said. "I've got a contact on the Federal Land Board who has been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation. If I can get these to him before Helena—" "3 weeks," Elias said. Carl looked at him. "You know the timeline." "I know it," Elias said. "What do you need from me?" Carl studied him for a moment. "You're a landowner in the Blue Creek Valley." "I am. Blue Creek is adjacent to 2 of the parcels named in this letter. Parcels Gerald's been working to acquire. If you testified before the commission about what you've observed in terms of activity on those parcels over the past 2 years—" "I'll testify," Elias said, without hesitation. Maggie looked at him sharply. "You don't have to," she started. "I'll testify," he said again, the same way he said things when they were not negotiable. If what Cole's been doing has touched Blue Creek Valley, then it touches me. And I'm not in the habit of letting things that touch me go unanswered. Carl nodded slowly. Then we have a case, he said. Helen, who had been quiet through all of it, put her hand on the kitchen table between all of them. Tonight, she said firmly, everyone eats and sleeps, in a bed with a roof and with no one chasing anyone. She looked at Elias with the expression of a woman who had made a decision. You're staying here. I don't want to hear an argument. Elias opened his mouth. I said I don't want to hear it, Helen said. Nora looked at Elias. She sounds like she means it, the girl said. She does, Maggie confirmed. Elias closed his mouth. He stayed. That evening after supper, after Nora had been put to bed in a real room, in a real bed for the first time in 5 days, and had fallen asleep in approximately 40 seconds after Carl had taken the letters to his study, and could be heard moving through papers with the focused energy of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. Elias stood on Helen and Carl's front porch and looked at Harlan's Creek settling into its evening. It was a small town. Hard like he remembered it. But it had the feeling of a place that was becoming something, buildings going up on the east end. A new water trough at the main street crossing the kind of incremental growth that meant people were choosing to stay. Maggie came out and stood beside him. They stood in the same easy proximity they'd been standing in for 5 days, close enough to talk without raising their voices far enough apart that nothing was assumed. You're going to go back to Blue Creek, she said. Not a question this time. She was just saying it out loud, shaping it with words the way people do when they need to make something real. After Helena, he said. After the commission meeting. That's 3 weeks, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The ranch can run 3 weeks without you. The Birch boy can check the cattle, he said. I've got enough laid up. She turned to look at him. So you could stay. I could stay, he said. The sentence had more in it than its words, and they both knew it. Elias, she said. I need to say something, and I need to say it plainly, because I have spent 9 years in a situation where nothing was plain, and I have made a decision that I will not do that again. He turned to face her fully. I am not a woman who moves fast, she said. I am not a woman who makes decisions without thinking them through. I have a daughter to consider and a life to rebuild, and I am under no illusions about how hard any of that is going to be. She paused. But I also spent the last 5 days watching a man I did not know become someone She stopped. Become someone I don't want to stop knowing. And I think you feel that too. And I think you're going to go back to Blue Creek, and you're going to talk yourself into believing that what's right for me is to let me do this without you, because that's what a man who thinks he's not built for people does. She looked at him steadily. And I'm telling you right now that I don't need that decision made for me. I can make my own decisions. I've been doing it rather successfully under the circumstances. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, You are the most direct person I have ever met. I know, she said. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's the opposite of a problem. She waited. I took 1 step toward her, just one, measured and deliberate, and he said, Then I'll say it plainly too. I don't want to go back to Blue Creek and not know you. I don't want to go back to that house and that table and that porch and sit in it, the way I've been sitting in it for 11 years now, that I know what it's supposed to feel like when it's not empty. He stopped. I don't know what that means yet. In practical terms. I don't know how you build something from here, but I know I want to try if you'll let me. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not the way she had across Ruth's table, though that had mattered. This was different. This was a decision. I'll let you, she said. He held her hand and looked at Harlan's Creek in the evening, and he felt the thing in his chest that had been building since a barn door and a storm finally arrive at the shape it had been moving toward all along. Not an ending. A beginning so quiet and certain it felt like something the mountains themselves had decided. The 3 weeks in Harlan's Creek did not pass gently. Elias had not expected them to. He'd learned somewhere in the years of working a ranch alone that the time before a hard thing is never the peaceful thing people imagine it will be. The waiting is its own kind of work, the kind that happens mostly in the chest and keeps a person up at 2 in the morning, sitting at a kitchen table that isn't their own, turning a cold coffee cup in their hands. Carl worked from before sunrise to well past dark every day, and Elias watched the shape of it from across the house, the correspondence going out, the careful packaging of the letters alongside Carl's own documentation, the measured and precise construction of an argument that had to be airtight before it reached Helena, because it would only get one chance. Carl was good at it. Elias had not known many lawyers, but he recognized the quality of a man who understood that the difference between winning and losing was almost always preparation, and Carl Whitmore prepared like a man who knew exactly what was at stake. On the fourth day, Renner came to Harlan's Creek. He came alone, which meant he was being careful. He rode down the main street on a Tuesday morning, and he tied his horse in front of the hotel and went inside and asked for a room, and Carl heard about it before the hour was out through the particular network of information that moves through a small town, like weather, fast, unavoidable, and respecting no particular boundaries. Carl came and found Elias in the yard, where he'd been splitting wood, because there was always wood to be split, and his hands needed something to do, and told him quietly, and Elias set down the axe. "He's inside the law," Elias said. "The federal letter still stands." "It stands until it doesn't," Carl said. "Once I file with the Land Commission, the letter becomes subject to review. A federal claim made by a man under federal investigation for land fraud starts looking very different." He paused. "But that's 3 weeks from now. Until then." "Until then, he's got legal standing to be here," Elias said. "Yes." They looked at each other. "Does Maggie know?" Elias asked. "Helen's telling her now," Carl said. Elias picked up the axe and set it in the shed and went inside. Maggie was in the kitchen, and she was standing very straight, with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and her face doing the contained thing. The thing where the surface held steady and everything else moved underneath it. Helen had one hand on her sister's shoulder and was saying something low and even. When Elias came through the door, Maggie looked at him. "He's in the hotel," she said. "I know," he said. "He won't come to the house," she said. "Not yet, not openly. That's not how Gerald works. He'll send Renner to establish presence to let me know he's close to make me afraid enough to come out on my own." She said it with the flatness of someone describing a pattern they've watched before. "He's done it before. When I visited my mother the year before she died, he sent a man to sit outside her house for 2 days, just to remind me who I belonged to." The kitchen was quiet. Helen's hand tightened on her sister's shoulder. Elias pulled a chair out from the table and sat down across from Maggie, and he waited until she looked at him directly. "He doesn't know about the letters," Elias said. "If he did, Renner wouldn't be sitting in the hotel. He'd have come straight to the house with the federal letter and taken you before Carl could move." Maggie absorbed this. "So he still thinks it's about control," she said. "He thinks if he puts enough pressure on me, I'll come back on my own, and whatever I took won't matter, because I'll be back under his roof." "That's what he thinks," Elias said. "Which means we don't change anything. Carl keeps working. You stay in this house. Nora stays in this house. And Renner sits in the hotel watching a door that we're not going to open." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "You're not afraid of him," she said. "No," Elias said. "Most people are afraid of Gerald," she said. "Not of him personally, of what he can do, of how far his reach goes." "His reach doesn't come this far without making noise," Elias said. "And Carl hears everything that makes noise in this town." He paused. "Gerald Cole is used to people who have less than he does. He's not used to people who have something he can't buy." "What's that?" she said. He held her eyes. Nothing left to lose to him. She was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the thing that precedes one, the change in the air before light arrives. "All right," she said. "All right." Helen exhaled beside her. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway, having materialized from wherever she'd been with the silent efficiency she'd inherited from nobody and developed entirely on her own. She looked at the 3 adults at the table and performed her customary rapid assessment. "Is the bad man here?" she asked. "His man is here," Maggie said carefully. Nora considered this. The deputy. Yes. Is he going to try to take us? Maggie looked at Elias, then back at her daughter. No, she said. He's going to try to scare us, and we're not going to let him. Nora looked at Elias. Are you going to make sure? Yes, Elias said. She nodded, satisfied, and came and sat at the table and asked Helen what was for lunch. And that was the end of her engagement with the crisis, which was somehow both the most practical and the most comforting response anyone in the kitchen had managed. Renner stayed in the hotel for 4 days. On the morning of the second day, he walked past Carl's house twice on the main street. Not stopping, just walking, establishing that he was there and that he knew where they were. Elias was on the porch when Renner made his second pass. He was sitting in the chair nearest the steps with his coffee, and he watched Renner come down the street, and watched Renner see him, and watched the small recalibration that moved through Renner's posture when he processed what he was looking at. Not the woman alone, not a family without protection, but a man on the porch who was watching him back with the particular quality of stillness that communicates without words. That this ground has been assessed, and the man on it has already decided how far things will go. Renner didn't stop. He kept walking. Elias drank his coffee. On the morning of the fourth day, Renner rode out of Harlan's Creek before the rest of the town was fully awake. Carl heard about it by 8. He came to breakfast and said simply, "He's gone." And Helen said, "Good." And Nora said, "I knew he would." And Maggie said nothing at all for a moment, and then she said, "He's gone to tell Gerald." "Yes," Carl said. "Which means Gerald will come himself," she said. "He might," Carl said. "Or he'll escalate through the courts, file new paperwork, try to get an injunction that forces your return while the federal claim is still active." He looked at her steadily. "But here's what Gerald doesn't know yet. I filed the preliminary documentation with the Land Commission yesterday. Everything we have copies of the letters, my own records, the name of the commissioner who's been on his payroll. It went to my contact in Helena by private courier." He paused. Gerald Cole went from being a man with a legal claim to a man under federal scrutiny overnight. He just doesn't know it yet. The table was silent. Maggie pressed both hands flat on the table in front of her. It was the gesture she made when she was holding something very large, very steady. "How long until he knows?" she asked. "When my contact receives the package," Carl said. 5 days at most. Once Gerald is officially under investigation, any federal claim he's made, through Renner, becomes immediately compromised. Renner would be acting on behalf of a man under federal scrutiny. No judge in the territory will back that up. 5 days, Elias said. 5 days, Carl confirmed. 5 days was both a long time and not long at all, and everyone at the table understood both things simultaneously. The 5 days passed. The way hard, waiting always does. Unevenly with the hours, alternately stretching and collapsing. The ordinary business of the household, continuing around the specific gravity of what was coming. Elias helped Carl where he could and found work where he couldn't. He repaired 2 things in the house that had been broken long enough to be ignored. He split more wood than 3 winters would require. He rode the perimeter of Carl's land property twice, not because it needed checking, but because his body needed the movement and his mind needed the ground. On the evening of the 3rd day, he and Maggie sat on the back porch after supper while the light went out of the sky, and she told him things she hadn't told anyone, not in detail, not in order, but in the way of a person who has been holding something compressed for a long time and is finally in a place where it can expand without breaking anything. She told him about the first year when she'd believed she could manage it. About the second year when she'd understood she couldn't. About the years after that, when she'd learned to navigate it, the ways Gerald's control worked the specific territories of her life, that she'd learned to keep hidden from him the internal life she'd built that he'd never been able to reach because he'd never known it was there. "I kept reading," she said. "He didn't know I was doing it, or he didn't care books he considered unimportant papers, anything I could get. I kept thinking. I kept myself intact. On the inside." She paused. "And I kept watching Nora. She was the part he couldn't calculate. He never knew what to make of her because she didn't behave the way he expected people to behave. She just looked at him. Those eyes. She almost smiled. He hated it. He'd tell her to do something, and she'd look at him for just a moment too long before she did it, and you could see it bothered him, this 8-year-old child looking at him like she was deciding whether he was worth listening to. Elias looked at her. She is the most remarkable child I have ever encountered. She is, Maggie said. She gets it from her grandmother. My mother was like that. She saw everything and said exactly as much as was necessary and not one word more. She paused. I think that's what I want for her. That kind of clarity. The ability to look at the world as it actually is and decide what to do with it. She already has it, Elias said. Maggie looked at him. Do you know what she told me last night? What? She said. Maggie stopped. There was something in her face that was complicated and warm at once. She said, Mama, I think Elias is the kind of person who stays. Not because he has to, because he decides to, and I think that's the best kind. She paused. Then she went to sleep. The quiet between them had that quality again, the full kind, the kind with texture. Smart kid, Elias said. His voice was not entirely steady, and he didn't try to make it so. She is, Maggie said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And he said, because 5 days of waiting, and 3 days of Renner, and 9 years of what she'd carried, and 11 years of what he'd carried, had reduced everything to its actual shape. I'm not going back to Blue Creek alone, Maggie. I want to say that clearly. I'm going back, but not alone. Whatever that means for you and Nora, whatever time that takes, and whatever it looks like, I'm not going back to that house to sit in it by myself. Not now that I know what it's supposed to feel like. She was very still. That is a large thing to say, she said. I know, he said. I've been a long time getting to it. I didn't want to underdo it. She looked at him for a moment that stretched into something permanent. Then she said, Ask me properly. He understood her immediately. He didn't require clarification. He stood up from the chair. He was not a man who'd practiced this, had never had occasion to, had long ago stopped imagining he would. But he stood up and turned to face her fully, the way he faced everything he'd decided was worth facing directly, and he said, Come to Blue Creek, you and Nora, not as guests, not temporarily. Come and stay. Help me figure out what that house is supposed to be. Because I think you know, and I think I'm ready to know it too. Maggie stood up. She was not a woman who cried easily. He'd learned that. She had the discipline of someone who'd learned to process things internally and completely before they reached her face. But there was something at the edges of her eyes now that she didn't try to conceal. Yes, she said. Simply. The way she said things when they mattered most. He reached out, and she came the one step forward that closed the distance, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood on Carl Whitmore's back porch in Harlan's Creek, Montana, in the summer of 1887, and the thing that had been building since a barn door, and a storm, and a woman who asked to stay, and a man who almost didn't open the door, arrived finally at itself. The 5th day came with a telegram. Carl received it before breakfast, and read it twice, and came to the table and sat down, and looked at all of them and said, It's done. The room held its breath. My contact received the package, Carl said. He took it directly to the commission chair, who took it directly to the Federal Land Board. Gerald Cole was served notice of federal investigation this morning in Billings. He paused. Every federal claim filed through Renner is suspended pending investigation. The commission is convening a special session before the Helena meeting to review the fraudulent purchases, and the commissioner named in the letters. He stopped. He's already resigned. Helen made a sound with her hand pressed to her mouth. Maggie sat very still. Nora looked at her mother. Is it over? She asked. Not entirely, Carl said honestly. Federal investigations take time. Gerald will fight it. He has lawyers and money, and he'll use both. But the railroad survey information has already been referred to the Federal Land Board, which means Gerald's scheme is public record now. The land he tried to acquire through false means, including the parcels adjacent to Blue Creek. He looked at Elias. Those purchases are all under review. He won't be able to touch them. Elias nodded. And us, Maggie said. The federal claim, Renner's letter. Suspended as of this morning, Carl said. A man under federal investigation for land fraud does not have standing to compel the return of a wife through federal channels. Any judge in the territory who looks at this situation now will see exactly what it is. He paused. You're free, Maggie. Legally, formally, completely. The word landed in the room, the way certain words do. Taking up more space than their single syllable suggested filling every corner. Free. Maggie pressed her hands flat on the table. She looked at them for a moment, those hands which had carried 4 folded letters across 6 days and 500 miles of fear, and then she looked up at Carl and said, "Thank you." "You did this," Carl said. "You took the letters. You made the decision. I just used what you gave me." "We all did," Helen said firmly, and looked at Elias, and her meaning was perfectly clear. Nora, sitting beside her mother, reached over and took Maggie's hand. Maggie gripped it and did not try to control what her face did next. The weeks that followed had the quality of something settling, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but the way water finds its level after a disturbance, moving steadily into the shape that was always waiting for it. The Helena Commission meeting confirmed everything Carl had filed. 2 of Gerald Cole's shell companies were dissolved by territorial order. 3 fraudulent land purchases were voided. The commissioner who'd resigned became the key witness in the federal case, and his testimony added dimensions to Gerald's fraud that even Carl hadn't fully anticipated. Gerald Cole, the well-respected businessman of Billings, the man who sat on 3 civic committees and donated to the church building fund, and smiled at people? He was destroying, found himself on the wrong side of a federal proceeding with no one left to buy his way out of it. He did not come to Harlan's Creek. He did not send Renner. He had a great many other problems to manage, and none of them left room for chasing a wife and daughter through the back country of Montana. Elias stayed through the commission proceedings. He testified calmly, precisely, in the way he did everything that mattered about the activity he'd observed on the Blue Creek parcels adjacent to Gerald's fraudulent purchases, about the unusual traffic on roads near his land over the past 2 years, about the specific pattern of approach that, in retrospect, told the story of a man who'd been preparing the ground for something he intended nobody to notice. The commission chair thanked him. The Federal Land Board agent took his statement separately. Carl said afterward that Elias's testimony had been the cleanest and most useful of the day, because he'd given them exactly what he'd observed, and nothing he hadn't, and that kind of precision was rarer than most people understood. Elias received this information and went back to splitting wood. On the evening before he and Maggie and Nora were set to leave for Blue Creek, Helen made a supper that was large enough for twice as many people as were at the table, and kept refilling everyone's glass and talking with the particular energy of a woman who is managing her feelings by moving through them at high speed. Carl watched her with the expression of a man who recognized this pattern and loved her for it. Nora ate everything put in front of her and then asked for more. After supper, Helen pulled Elias aside in the hallway, which was not a subtle maneuver, but was an effective one. She looked at him directly the way she did most things, the family resemblance to her sister, most pronounced in moments of directness. "I need to say something to you," she said. "All right," he said. "My sister has spent 9 years being very careful about who she trusts," Helen said. She trusted Gerald because he was patient, and he was convincing, and she was 22, and didn't yet know what she was looking at. And then she spent 9 years learning the cost of that trust, and she came out the other side intact. She came out better than intact. She came out clear, but she is not a woman who will let herself be wrong about a person twice. She paused. Which means she has looked at you very hard, the same way she looks at everything, and she has decided. And when my sister decides, she doesn't go back on it. She held his eyes. Don't make her wrong. It was not a threat. It was something more serious than a threat. It was a statement of what was at stake, said plainly by a woman who loved the person she was asking him to be careful with. "I won't," he said. Helen looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once the way people nod when they've heard the truth and recognized it. "Good," she said. "Now come finish your pie. Carl made it himself, and he's very proud of it, and it's not actually very good, but we're all going to eat it anyway." He finished the pie. It was not very good. He ate every bite. They left Harlan's Creek the next morning, the 3 of them with 4 days of provisions and the good horses, and Nora in the middle on the trail gelding, which she had by now convinced herself was fundamentally her horse, regardless of what the legal facts might be. Helen stood on the porch and watched them go. Carl stood beside her. Helen was not crying. She was standing with her shoulders back and her chin up and her hand raised, and she kept it raised until they had turned the corner onto the main road and she could no longer see them. Elias saw none of this. He was at the front of the line, reading the road ahead, the way he always was. Maggie saw it. She turned once and looked at her sister standing on that porch, with her hand raised, and something crossed her face that was both grief and gratitude. In the same moment, the specific emotion of someone leaving the people they love towards something they've chosen, which is never simple and is always worth it. She turned back to the road. They rode. The way back to Blue Creek was not the backcountry route. With Renner gone and Gerald's legal standing dissolved, they could take the main roads, which were faster and smoother, and gave Nora the opportunity to observe and comment on every town and homestead and interesting-looking rock formation they passed, which she did with sustained dedication for 4 days. On the second day, somewhere on the open road between one small town and the next, Nora pulled her horse up alongside Elias and rode beside him for a while in companionable silence. He let the silence exist without filling it because he'd learned that was the right thing to do with her. Eventually she said, "Is your barn the same one from the storm?" "Same one," he said. "Does it still have the stove in the back?" "Still has it." "Good," she said. "I liked that stove." She was quiet for a moment. "I liked the horses too, the gray one and the brown one." A pause. "I'd like to continue my conversations with them." "They'll be glad to hear it," Elias said. She seemed satisfied by this and fell back into silence. Then, "Are we going to be your family?" He rode for a moment without answering. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the weight of the question required him to be careful with how he gave it. "If you want to be," he said. Nora considered this with the seriousness she applied to all important matters. "I do," she said. Simply. The way her mother said things when they mattered most. He looked at her, this remarkable, serious too. Old for her years girl, with her small hands on the reins and her back straight in the saddle, and he felt something move through him that had no precedent in his experience and needed none. It was its own thing entirely. Complete. "Then that's what we'll be," he said. Nora nodded, satisfied. She moved her horse back to the middle of the line, and Elias looked at the road ahead and felt for the first time in a very long time that it was going somewhere worth going. They arrived at Blue Creek Valley on a late afternoon in early September, when the summer was just beginning to think about becoming something else. The light going gold and long, the air carrying the first suggestion of what was coming without being willing to commit to it yet. The valley looked the way it always looked to Elias, coming back to it like the thing in the world that recognized him most completely. He stopped on the rise above the ranch and looked at it. He had stood on this rise 100 times, 1,000. He had looked at this ranch and felt what it was to have built something with his own hands and his own years and his own stubbornness. He had felt on every one of those occasions something like satisfaction. He felt that now. But underneath it, sitting in a place that had been empty until very recently, was something else. Something that the satisfaction had never had beneath it before. He heard Maggie's horse come up beside him. She looked at the ranch below. At the barn, the same barn where she'd knocked 3 times in the rain, where a man had opened a door he'd been keeping closed for 11 years. At the house with its clean lines and its empty porch and its kitchen table with 3 chairs. At the pasture where the horses stood in the late light, heads low and quiet. "It's a good place," she said. "It's going to be a better one," he said. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. And in the long gold light of early September in the Blue Creek Valley, with Nora's voice coming from behind them, asking if the gray horse would remember her, something that had been broken for a long time on both sides of this moment, arrived at the shape it had always been moving toward. They rode down. Nora went straight to the barn. They heard her from inside the house, having what was clearly a reunion with the gray horse conducted entirely in the serious conversational register she reserved for things she considered important. The horse, by all available evidence, was glad to see her. Maggie stood in the kitchen. She put her hand on the table, that table with 3 chairs, and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Elias. "Where do you want me?" she said. Meaning the kitchen. Meaning supper. Meaning the practical arrangement of this evening, this first evening. He understood all the layers of the question. "Right here," he said. "Exactly here." She held his eyes for one moment. Then she turned to the stove. His stove, their stove, and she built a fire the way she had that first morning, competent and certain, as if she'd been doing it in this kitchen for years. He sat down at the table, the chair that faced the window. The one he'd never sat in before because it had always felt like someone else's chair. He sat in it now, and it fit him exactly, and he understood that the reason it had always felt like someone else's chair was because it had been all along waiting. Nora came in from the barn with hay in her hair and the particular brightness of a child who has been exactly where she wanted to be. She looked at Elias at the table. She looked at her mother at the stove. She looked at the 3 chairs around the table. She pulled out the middle chair and sat down. "The gray horse remembered me," she announced. "I told her we were staying. She seemed pleased." "I'm glad," Elias said. "She'll want extra apples," Nora said, "for the emotional significance of the occasion." "I'll get some in town," he said. Nora nodded gravely. Good. Supper was ordinary. It was the most ordinary thing Elias had experienced in 11 years, the movement of people in a kitchen, the sound of dishes, the particular noise of conversation that has nowhere important to be, and so goes everywhere, comfortably touching everything lightly. Nora talked about what she'd observed on the road. Maggie talked about what she wanted to plant, if they could still get seeds in before the season turned. Elias talked about which pastures would need work before winter, and what the horses needed, and where the best firewood was already cut. They talked like people who had been doing this for years. They talked like people who intended to do it for many more. After supper, after Nora had been put to bed in the room that became hers, without ceremony or declaration, she had simply put her bag in it, and that had been that. Elias and Maggie sat on the porch. The same porch. The stars the same as they'd been that first night before the shape of everything had changed. But the porch was different now, not in any physical way. Different in the way that places become different when the people in them have decided to stay. "I want to write to Helen tomorrow," Maggie said. "We'll ride to Callaway for paper," he said. "And I need to tell Tom Birch we're back." "He'll be pleased." "He'll be insufferable," Elias said. "He'll say he knew from the minute he rode into my yard and saw you in the garden." "Did he?" Maggie said. "Probably," Elias said. "Tom has always been smarter about me than I am." She smiled. She leaned her head against his shoulder, simply without ceremony, the way a person does when they've decided this is where they are, and he put his arm around her, and they sat. The valley was dark and enormous and completely quiet. Everything that had been lost, and everything that had been afraid, and everything that had built walls and spent years behind them, sat right there on that porch, and was finally exactly where it was supposed to be. A man who had lived 40 deciding he wasn't built for love had been wrong. Not in a complicated way. Not in a way that required analysis or apology or careful management. Just wrong the simple way. And it turned out that being wrong about that, being spectacularly, completely fundamentally wrong about the most important thing, was the best thing that had ever happened to him. The storm had come, and a woman had knocked 3 times, and he had opened the door. And every single thing that mattered had walked in from the rain. He held her on the porch under the Montana stars, and he did not think about the 11 years of empty rooms behind him, because behind was not the direction he was looking anymore. He looked at the valley. He looked at the stars. He breathed. And in the house behind them, in the room that was hers. Now, Nora slept deeply peacefully, the way she always slept, when she had decided the place she was in was safe and outside in the barn that had once sheltered strangers in a storm. The gray horse stood in her stall in the dark entirely content, asking nothing from the night, except what it had already given her. The Blue Creek Valley held all of them. And this time, when Elias looked at his ranch at the fences he'd built, and the pastures he'd shaped, and the barn that had stood through every storm, this country could throw at it, he did not see a man's monument to surviving alone. He saw home. Not because it had changed, because he finally